Hey there. So doing something a little bit different on the channel today. Gonna be in front of the camera. Let me know in the comments below, do you like seeing my face? Does it even matter? Alright, let's get into the video. When you think about your deepest, darkest desires, what do you think about? Maybe you think about money, fame, the perfect partner. Maybe you want a simple life, just enough money to get by. Maybe a farm. Maybe you just want freedom. You just want to be able to do whatever you want, whenever you want. Well, if you asked French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, he'd probably just say you're wrong about all of it. You don't know what you really desire. One film that speaks to this idea perfectly is the 2013 film Don John, featuring Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Scarlett Johansson. Today we're going to dive into that film, break it down, and really deconstruct what desire is, what it is that we actually desire. So let's hop into the film analysis. Alright, let's start with a recap of Don John. Don John centers around the titular John. Now John is the man. Women want him and men want to be John. John goes to the gym consistently. John gets attention of all the women around him. John has a good group of friends. And John is Italian American. Now John has a problem. Every time he finds a woman, they just don't live up to his expectations. This results in him having to go to pornography to look at women and really live out those fantasies that he really desires. This all changes when he meets Barbara. Barbara immediately catches his eye and he's able to win her over. John and Barbara start seeing each other and everyone encourages this relationship. His parents are ecstatic and his friends think that he's hit the jackpot. Except there's one thing about Barbara. She still, somehow, does not live up to his expectations. John resorts back to his use of pornography and Barbara is very, very upset about this. Barbara wants him to stop, however, he just can't. Inevitably, she finds out that John's been using pornography and the relationship is over. Barbara had been pressuring John to go to night school, and there he meets Esther. After his failed relationship with Barbara, Esther and John grow closer and closer until he realizes that maybe Esther is who's able to fulfill him after all, and he's finally able to give up his pornography addiction. Now, the film seems like a very typical rom-com, everything that you'd expect. We have a protagonist, he meets a woman who doesn't live up to his expectations, and then he finds who appears to be his true love. However, the film really delves into desire and what it means to desire. Now, for the framework that we're going to be looking at for this film, we're going to use the psychoanalyst Lacan. Lacan's theories really center around desire. Now, when we're discussing desire, what we really mean is a lack. For Lacan, there's no way to desire something if you already have it. So fundamentally, desire is always constituted by a lack. This is very, very key to understanding Lacan, and it's very important for understanding what's going on in Don John. Now let's break down a few of Lacan's key concepts. The first would be the phallus. Now, when we discuss the phallus, we don't mean the appendage. For Lacan, the phallus is really the center of desire, and it's really the symbol in what we can think of as the root of all lack. For Lacan, there are three registers. Similar to Freud's id, ego, and superego, Lacan also has three domains within the psyche. There's the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. The imaginary is the world of images, and this is how we see each other. It isn't literally what isn't there as in imaginary, but it is the image. When one looks at oneself, they are creating an image of a whole person. The symbolic realm is that which contains all of these symbols, these signifiers that we use in daily life. Think of something like a stop sign when you're driving down the road. This tells one that one should stop. This would fall into the symbolic register. And the real is everything that's left over that isn't able to be characterized by the imaginary or the symbolic. At the very center of all these registers is the phallus. The phallus is that thing which is the primordial lack, and it is what Lacan calls the master signifier. This starts the chain of signification, and it's really what is at the center of lack. The phallus is that which one aims to become, though they never can, so it's just an endless loop of attempting to become the phallus. However, you're always striving for the phallus. And this is John to a T. John's able to go to the gym, and John's able to be handsome, and he's able to win over women. John is aiming to be the phallus. He's aiming to be the object of everybody else's desires. However, he can never be the phallus, and in effect, he is always attempting to reach the phallus himself. This really gives us insight into who John is at his core, as someone who aims to be the object of others' desire. He wants the gaze of the other. However, he's always looking to fulfill his own desire. This is an endless loop, and he'll never be able to break out of this loop. In Lacan's view, subjects are constituted by their desire. So, being a subject, John is inevitably going to desire more, and he's not ever able to be that full image of a complete person without any desire that he strives to be. Next, let's look at what Barbara is and how that relates to John's desire. John views Barbara as a perfect specimen. John thinks that she's going to be the perfect person. She's a 10 out of 10 in his own words. Of course, a 10 out of 10 means that this person would be perfect. John starts seeing Barbara and something's just off. Everybody else sees that she's perfect, but to John, there's something that's missing. And this is why John resorts back to pornography. He's not having the fantasy that he believed he would have. Now, this is important because the way that desire functions in a Lacanian worldview is that desire can never be complete. Desire is a fundamental part of the subject. Like I said earlier, subjects are constituted by their desire. Desire is necessarily a lack. You can't desire something that you already have. So we can see that fundamentally, desire is always constituted by a lack in the Lacanian worldview. Now, when he meets Barbara, John desired to be with Barbara. However, he gets her, and with her perfections, he's no longer able to desire anything about Barbara. This is why he resorts back to the fantasy world. When John is looking at pornography, he's able to have a barrier between himself and the real world where he's able to continuously desire. It's not so much about the sex, it's more so about the ability to desire someone that's more real. The way that Barbara is portrayed, she's too perfect. She isn't even real. She's not a real person. And John fundamentally desires a real person. This is where Esther comes in. John meets Esther during the night school, and at first John seems bothered by her. She's an older woman, and she seems to butt in to John's personal life. She looks at him watching pornography and mentions it to him. John, of course, is embarrassed. However, Esther doesn't hide anything. She is able to reveal herself. She's able to be vulnerable with John. And this just adds to the realness of Esther. She's not a perfect idealized person like Barbara is. Esther is a real person, warts and all. She's older. She's not the most beautiful. I don't think anyone would be saying that she's a 10 out of 10 if they saw her out at a nightclub. However, she's a real person. When John later gets with Esther, he's able to fulfill his sexual fantasies, and he no longer needs the pornography as the barrier between him and the real. He has Esther, and she's real to him, and this is only due to her limitations. John is able to desire her because there's still more to desire. There's a lack of perfection within Esther that allows John to perpetually desire her so that fantasy is never fulfilled. Fantasy and desire are sustained precisely because Esther is not perfect. And this leads us to our last concept for Lacan, and this is called the objet petit a. The objet petit a can be thought of as the object cause of desire. It is not the object of desire. So when we look at it, it is not Barbara who's the object of desire for John, but we want to see what the object cause of desire for him. I've heard it explained as that barrier, and as we've discussed previously, pornography for John is that barrier. When John's able to watch pornography, like I said, it's not about the sex, it's about the fantasy. And as we discussed earlier, desire is integral to sustaining a subject. Through John's ability to desire, he's able to sustain his subjectivity. This objet petit a, the pornography, this is the very limit towards desire. We can look at something Slavoj Žižek, a Lacanian, says about the objet petit a. He tells a story of a man out to dinner with a woman. The man knows that once the dinner ends, he'll be able to have intercourse with the woman. However, while he's at dinner, he just keeps ordering more food. He doesn't want the date to stop. When this date stops, he has to encounter his fantasy. That's precisely what he doesn't want. It's the anticipation, it's the desiring that we really want. It's the sustaining of the fantasy that lets us dive into the real. For John, this is his pornography. Now, it's interesting that Barbara catches John looking at pornography and wants him to stop. She says it's disgusting and he's completely embarrassed. John tells her that he'll stop, and he truly wants to. However, what she's doing there is she's squashing all fantasy and all desire. Barbara actually is the barricade between John and his desire. Paradoxically, because she is that idealized, perfect partner for John. In his own words, like I said, she's a 10 out of 10. However, she comes in and she squashes any aspect of desire for John. This is why John so desperately seeks the pornography, and why when he meets Esther, it's a breath of fresh air later in the movie. Now, I also want to point out a very interesting distinction between Barbara in Don John and Summer in 500 Days of Summer. If you watch my previous video, you know I'm a huge fan of 500 Days of Summer. Now, in 500 Days of Summer, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who plays John in the movie Don John, plays Tom in 500 Days of Summer. Tom is enamored with Zooey Deschanel's character Summer. Now, it's very interesting when we look at how Tom idealizes Summer versus how John idealizes Barbara. In the movie 500 Days of Summer, Tom is able to pick out the little quirks of Summer, and he names them in the film. There's a scene where he says that he loves her smile, her 1960s bangs. There's a little heart-shaped birthmark on her chest. Later in the film, when he's distraught over the relationship, he mentions that she has a crooked smile. He hates her stupid haircut, and he hates the little cockroach-shaped birthmark. Those things that appeared quirky, the imperfections of Summer, later reveal themselves to actually be imperfections. The reason that Tom was able to be so enamored with Summer and his desire was continuously there was, one, Summer never fully committed to Tom, but two, she had imperfections herself. It was her quirkiness that allows Tom to sustain his fantasies and his desires for Summer. Let's contrast this with Barbara from Don John. John doesn't see any imperfections in Barbara. Yes, she has personality quirks. However, he's able really to see past those, and I don't know if he really sees those as big issues. Later on in the film, his sister finally speaks up after silence throughout the film to tell him how Barbara wasn't great. However, when John was with Barbara, physically, she was exactly what he wanted. This is the stark contrast from Summer's character in 500 Days of Summer, in that Barbara doesn't have the quirks. She doesn't have the little imperfections. She is perfect in John's eyes. And this just shows us how John really isn't able to get that fantasy and desire that he's so desperately looking for. Don John is a meditation on desire and what it means to idealize a partner. When one idealizes a partner, you're lifting them up and elevating them to a level where the real gets lost. There is no relationship because the person has no ability to be desired. John shows us that with Esther, he's able to be vulnerable and he's able to be comfortable. He no longer seeks to be the object of everybody else's desire. He's able to desire Esther, a real person, warts and all. She has imperfections, but this is what actually makes her quote-unquote perfect. Paradoxically, those that are perfect and idealized, they lose their value in fantasy and their ability to be desired. Don John shows us that we should really embrace those imperfections in our partners and stop seeking to look for that perfect person, because it's really the imperfections that lead us to the real and to a real relationship.